Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Peter Hans Haber. Wie geht es dir? Hello? How are you? That's what that means. I wanted to tell you about my life. My life was a very difficult one, and this will be my biography. Though short, it will give you a good idea about my life and what happened with my life from age when I was born all the way to age 78 years old and 1 month from 79 when I had passed away. The date is 1933, November 11th to be specific, and my father, Edward Haber, and my mother, Friedrich Haber. Actually, most people just called her Frida. All lived with my brother, Horst Haber. Back in the day, we used to pronounce her name Haber. My brother really never got over that. Matter of fact, he always wanted to be called Haber instead of Haber. But later on, I'll discuss the differences and how that changed. So, we went on and lived there, and it was actually considered East Berlin.
Yes.
Now, East Berlin itself basically was a part of how can I say this? That giving you a long history. East Berlin, which is now today part of entire Germany, existed from 1949 to 1990. It consisted of the Soviet sector of Berlin, established in 1945 after the war. The American, British, and French sectors became the West Berlin, strongly associated with West Germany, while East Berlin was the de facto capital of East Germany. So East Berlin was the de facto capital of East Germany. Now, it was founded in 1949, and it was dissolved in 1990. At the time that we lived, we had looked at it as East Berlin. Though it was predominantly, it was so very close to the border of Russia. We spoke Russian and we also spoke German. But it was an old German, which most of you wouldn't even understand who speak German at this point. Now, previous to East Berlin, basically, it existed as 1945 through June of 1945, May through June, as the Soviet and East German commandments of East Berlin. And a lot of, like I said, a lot of these people were Russian. And as you know, in 1990, they tore down the Berlin Wall, which was dividing East and West Berlin. And that was made, that wall that in 1949. So, anyway, we lived in what the Eastern Bloc would be considered as Berlin. Now, my family, we lived a pretty simple life. My mother, she worked at a local shoe factory that we had. A lot of women were not allowed to work, but my family had owned part of a shoe factory, but it was the richer part of our family, who was actually non-Jewish. This part of our family was Jewish, and that is where my mother had worked. Unfortunately, in 1942, it was bombed, and luckily my mother was not there that day. So, from 1941 to 1942, that's where she worked. My father worked as a freedom fighter, and he actually fought for the freedom of the citizens. And at the time, it was the Soviets, which we did not look at as being a problem. But the other people who lived in the area, many of them looked at the Soviets as a problem. We were Jewish, so we also, at times, we had moved to another apartment, which was in more of a Jewish area, which I will also get to later on in this conversation. Anyway, her factory was blown up, and she had to go back to working at home, and then we did not have any form of income. So my father was the only form of income, and then he had to try to leave the freedom fighting because he had to support the family. Right before that happened, he had a bad case of diabetes, and it just so happens that not having the mobile ability to be able to move fast, he was shot, and shot near the leg, matter of fact. And this ended up becoming my father's demise in 1943. When I was very young, 1943 into 1944. So my father, he perished at that time. My mother had to take care of my brother and myself. Horst. Now, Horst was about 10 years older than I was, roughly. And basically, he was the older kid of the two. He was always my big brother. and he did a okay job as a sibling. We had our brotherly fights, but he saw a lot of the pre 1941 life in Germany, and saw more of a family than I had ever seen. My father, obviously, he perished, and we could not afford a funeral. One of his family members, who was of the, had owned the factory, they had helped us with a burial, and he had been given a proper burial. My mother was there then, stuck taking care of all of us, all three of us, unfortunately. My father did not leave anything as well. So we had to fend for ourselves. Now, when we moved at that point to the Jewish sector, and at that point they were rounding up a lot of Jews. My mother was Jewish. My father was not. So at this point, that made us Jewish, and even though we did not really celebrate it much, we had to go to that area of the sector of the basically the area, the block, and they made us wear stars to show that we were Jewish. At that time, Germany started up really firing its rhetoric about Jews and about, not liking Jews anymore. His power became very strong, and that's when he decided to invade other countries, of course. Now, the Soviets were much more powerful, but the Germans really had the upper hand in technology. They were, matter of fact, everything from the Messerschmitts, which is a plane, one of the fastest planes at that time, and the best of bombers at that time, all the way to, they were on the brink of rocket fuel and and actually sending rockets out. They also were looking at UFOs. They were looking at they were doing experimentation on many people, especially the Jewish children. And we'll get to that here towards the end as well. But anyway, we were in that area, and one day they came and they took my mother. It was after 3 different tries. My mother used to take me and put me underneath her pillow, and she would go ahead. And I had thought at the time, I was so young, I was only, 12, 11, and I used to think that she was trying to smother me. I was born in 1933, and, what is a kid to think? My brother used to tell me to be quiet, and my mother used to just, try to. My brother was big enough himself; he would go hide. But me, I screamed, and matter of fact, one day I screamed too loud, and I gave it away. They took my mother, and my brother ran after them in the Jeep, where my mother, they had my mother in shackles, basically, and they put her in the back of the Jeep, and they drove off. My brother ran after them, and I ran after my brother, and they drove about a few miles. We ran, and all of a sudden we come up to this area where it was very smelly. It was disgusting. There was bodies everywhere, and it was matter of fact, there's at times that we would see 8 bodies just piled on each other. There were walls, basically, of bodies. And that's how they would, clean the area up, is they would, instead of scattering everybody, they would take the body of the soldiers, the bodies of the people they've killed, and the dead, themselves, and the people that died of natural causes, and they would put them up in these stacks, and then they would burn the stacks. So it was a very foul stench. At this point, we pretty much knew that my mother was doomed. There were stories in the sector where the Jews lived of people being sent to Poland, and especially a place called Auschwitz, and was considered the area of death. That's what they called it. We always were scared. I would have dreams at night, and we knew eventually we probably would all be there, or have the same fate as my father or my mother. So anyway, my brother and I, we walked back knowing the fate that my mother was going to incur. And we found out later that day that our uncle and our aunts all were rounded up. Everybody who lived in that area. We came back to an empty apartment. It was completely empty. Everything was empty. Everything was gone. You smelled the stench of gunfire, blood, very gory. You could smell the smoke. You could see even the smell of timber, where they would break down the doors, and there were pieces that you had to be very careful of when you're opening the door, because the pieces would stick out and would actually stick into the side of you as you walked in. So my brother and I, we went ahead and we lived there. My brother was he's 10 years older than I am. He's an older brother, so we lived, and he would go out and we would steal food. He would steal food, I would steal food. Usually it was everyone for themselves, because I was beginning to be a teenager, and he was already somewhere around 20 years old. So basically everybody did what they could possibly do. One day we had another knock at the door, and my brother-in-law and I, we hid downstairs and underneath the floorboards. This was, they're like apartments, but they did have like basements and stuff where you could wash clothes. They didn't have washer and dryers. They had, where you'd have a bucket and you'd have to wash all your stuff and hang it. But we hid down there, and that's apparently the popular place to hide, because they immediately found us, grabbed us, and took us to another, like a camp. At this camp, we saw a bunch of other children, anywhere from ages 8 to early 20s, and some weren't obviously children, but they were, young men. And they would line everybody up right at like ditches, and they would shoot us, and our bodies would fall into the grave that they already had it dug out, or the trenches. It's like a gigantic, trench, basically. Well, they asked us to pull our pants down, and pow, 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 they shot. But luckily, they only got a portion of me, and they did not get my brother. We were happy to still be standing by everybody else. They fell into the grave, and we didn't understand why this happened, because we thought we were, that was it. So the Germans told us to suit back up and get back to the camp. So that's what we did. We put on our clothes, we headed back to the camp. Later, we had some people tell us that we were lucky that they were going to send us out. So we thought, man, how can we be so lucky to escape that? Well, as it turns out, most people that were Jewish were circumcised. That means they had part of their penis cut off, and that was part of the culture for Jews, and it was not the culture for Germans at all, or Europeans. It was considered as painful to the young baby. So, and obviously, it probably was. But I know today, most people in culture, lots of cultures do that, except for still some places in Europe. So they ended up seeing that we were not circumcised. It means we were just natural down there, and everybody else was. So it led to their death. Unfortunately, not to be funny here, but our penises saved our life. So we went ahead and we were happy to live, end up continuing to work in the work camps. And each day we tried to escape. And then one day, a German officer came over to us, and this area was getting bombed, and because we were considered German children, they took off our shackles and let us go. We didn't reveal who our ancestry was. We were only identified by numbers and the star that we had to wear. So we were on our own, but again, now we had to survive again, and it's not like in today's environment where you find a job. You can't do that. The town, the city, the country. Now, Hitler had a mistress, and he had a wife. His wife he loved, she lived in the house, and then he had his mistress, who he adored even more. And Hitler went ahead and took a cyanide capsule, along with his mistress, and Hitler, he shot himself. His his mistress, she just died. I won't go into her name or go into any of the history of that. You can look that up, but that doesn't really. Her name was Ava, but it doesn't really apply to the story. But anyway, it was it's a sad circumstance. So he killed himself, killed her. They then set everything on fire, and then it got set on fire again as they used blowtorches as when they were trying to get in. So they didn't find anything except for Hitler's teeth. And they tried to identify the teeth. They identified it as Adolf Hitler's. And Eva, she was easy to identify. I, at this point, had no food. My brother had no food. We were both broke. No money, no nothing outside. Every night, it was like being a bum. You had nothing. My brother all of a sudden took off. He left. He left me. Don't know where he went. At that time, we never really discussed it, but he left, and it was basically, I think he felt that he couldn't survive having to take care of me and himself. So it was every man for themselves. And at this point, after going through everything from and being a very young age and seeing war and devastation and death every day, I was basically a man at this point. So I ended up going and finding a convent. I stayed over at the convent, and the convent, they later on at night, men would come over. I don't know what men they were, but they would come over and touch me and not be very nice to me. Sometimes I would get slapped or whipped. The women there, sometimes the nuns, some of the nuns, many were nice. And thank God that they were, because at that point, if they weren't, I don't think I would have survived this experience. But I had no choice. I had to stay there because I had nowhere to go, and I was not skilled in finding food, and I had my goat. Well, they didn't want my goat there. I had it sitting outside, and then I was able to find a little spot for it right next to the convent. I went ahead and had the goat in there with some straw, and each day I would try to take some of my food and go feed the goat. And he started getting bigger, and that created problems for me. So I went ahead and one day just took a walk with my goat, and basically we took a walk down through the streets, looking at the devastation. Most of the gunfire was done. There was a little gunfire that took place all of a sudden, and I tried to get my goat with me, and we found a building to hide into that was half wrecked, but it did have a door. And When we walked in there, unfortunately, a member of the German army was in there. Now, those guys were also very hungry, and they were killers. So, they thought it would be very funny to go ahead and try to kill me. So again, I had a gun pointed to my head, and the only thing I had was my goat, and trying to put my hands up in the air, my goat ran off. Well, one of the other soldiers grabbed the goat and took the goat. I was so upset about it, I tried to run off and figured I would be shot, but I didn't care because at this point my goat was gone, and I made it down the road, and then I turned back to go get my friend, my goat. And as I did that, I saw my goat get slaughtered. They had cut his neck and already were draining the blood into a little, like a rusty bucket. And they took the goat and unfortunately boiled it. The other guy was cooking up some water, and they cut it in pieces. I mean, I could see that, and they stuck it in there. And at this point, I figured, do I go back there and try to eat some of the goat and pretend that I brought it to them? But I, was a very stubborn person, and at this point, I had to figure out some way to survive. I walked away, tripped over a dead soldier. I looked down. He had some tags on him. I couldn't really make out what it said. It had blood on the tags. I reached into his pocket, grabbed out what was like a wallet, and in the wallet I opened it up, and he had money in there, and he had cigarettes, and so I grabbed the cigarettes. I don't smoke, never smoked, but I figured I could sell them. And then I grabbed the wallet. I think I could sell the wallet, but then I thought maybe I'd get in trouble for it. So I left the wallet back, put it back in the pocket, but not before, I took the money, and then I saw a picture of his family. He had a picture of his wife, beautiful lady with blonde hair, very gorgeous, looked like a model. Himself, he was holding his son, and she was holding the daughter. And he was just rotting now on the street. And that is what happens when you have war. Death. Not a fun situation whatsoever. I have returned from death itself. I am, at this day, I died on October 12th. Well, I actually came back and they restored me back, but then they had me back on machines, and then they ended up turning the machines off. But October 13th, I died October 13th, 2012. Again, my name is Peter. middle initial is H for Hans, and my last name is Haber. You can look it up. But I'm making this recording from the dead with help from some people who I suppose are paranormal researchers. And I want to tell my story so that way my story is heard. So, while I still have the energy to do this, I don't do this with a mouth, I don't do this with a brain, I do this with energy. And enforcing that energy is very difficult when you don't have a lot of it. I have to take the energy from wherever I can get it, from a battery, from a light bulb, from wherever. So, anyway, I'm going to finish the story here of my life. The date is today, by the way. It's 2019. And I had been dead for almost 6 years. So my energy still exists. You're hearing it. I'm playing this on someone's iPhone. But I'm hoping that whoever gets this, they send it out. Or please send this to my son, Eric Haber. He lives in Michigan. I'd like for him to be able to have this. So I plead for you, please. I'm sending this as some kind of a memo. I found a way to record through an iPhone. I guess they call them iPhones. Before I had passed away, they only had the smaller iPhone. I think they called it iPhone 4. But I had one of those. I'm a little familiar with it. But anyway, I'm going to finish my story here. I don't have a lot of time here left here on Earth. So, to go back to what happened, I tripped over the gentleman. I saw his family, and I really realized what family was about. And I also realized that he didn't need the money anymore. He had moved on. So I grabbed the money from his wallet, and I moved on myself. So, took off, left, saw other soldiers. I couldn't bear sitting and seeing their pictures. It was too much to handle that day, though. Later, in the next few days, I would just try to skip that part. It was so painful, but I had to get the money to live. I saw a bread stand. It was on the side of the road. And these roads at this point were, they had been blown up by bombs. Half the time you go down a road, it's sealed off because it's a gigantic crater. So they didn't use orange cones back in the day. They used like twine to rope everything off. So you would see a sign that said danger on it. And it was spelled in English, just like it is in America. That way, it's kind of universal, danger signs. But anyway, I continued on, and all of a sudden, I saw this, like I said, I saw this bread stand. I went and I ran up to it, and this was an old Russian man. It looked like he was setting up a store for the first time. This was on the edge of Russia and Germany. Matter of fact, they had soldiers that were marching back and forth, and I knew I had to turn back, but I saw the bread, and I was so hungry I had to grab a piece. So I ran over, I grabbed some bread off of his stand, and I ran as fast as I could. All of a sudden, I stumbled and looked up, and Russian soldiers were in my face. They were laughing at me, and the gentleman all of a sudden grabbed the bread out of my hands forcefully and told me that I had to pay for it. And luckily, living in this area of East Berlin, I can understand some Russian, so I could speak German and Russian. So it helped at times like this. So I went ahead and I listened to this gentleman. He pointed at me and kind of hit me a little bit. Grabbed my ear, gave me what they call an ohrfeiger. It's they grab your ear and they twist it, and then he picked me up off the ground. I was so skinny that I only weighed 60 pounds, maybe 55 pounds, and I was, 13, so I should have been almost 100 pounds, but I was half my weight. I went ahead and tried to leave. The Russians laughed at me. They had been drinking. The gentleman, he said sorry, and he walked off, and I was now in the hands of these intoxicated soldiers, Russian soldiers. They weren't too nice to me either. All of a sudden, we left and we went back to this fire that they had. It was a pretty large bonfire. They were using German pieces that would burn quickly. And they would laugh and throw in a helmet, a German helmet or whatever. And all of a sudden there was a total of 5 guys, and then there was 10. And anyway, I sat there, and they had my hands twined up with basically twine. I was starting to bleed on my hands. I asked them to release me, and they just continued to laugh. I let them know that, I wasn't German, and they laughed at me on that as well. I was thinking maybe I could convince them that I was Soviet, and they wouldn't hurt me. Well, hours went by, about 6-7 hours, and it was getting dark, and these guys were extremely intoxicated. One of them fell down and actually fell asleep in his chair and fell down into the snow. The fire started diminishing, started getting colder out. I couldn't feel my hands, my nose, nothing. I went ahead and asked the guy if he could help me, asked the group, and they said, finally this time they agreed and said no problem. I thought, well, no problem. I mean, why didn't you just do it earlier, Apparently I was their pawn for the night. They wanted to make fun of me. So, the Germans, a few of them were walking by, and they stayed far away, and they didn't intervene whatsoever. The Russians and them were still, they would still shoot each other. I had seen it many times where even the war was over with, they still shot at each other, but so they try to avoid each other for the most part. When the war is over with, you don't want to be caught killing someone else, because that's basically you get accused of murder. So, but these guys didn't care about any of that. The guy who was laughing the most grabbed his pistol and said, "Hey, you ever seen a gun?" He gives me his pistol, like a .45. I took it. I thought about, I checked the chamber, and little did they know that I knew how to fire one. And I had enough bullets to kill all of them. So, I was not a skilled marksman at this time. Always, after this point in my life, decided to be a skilled marksman. I said if I had ever gotten the chance, I wanted to be, because this is the time where I needed it. But I knew that I would maybe kill one or two, and then they would kill me. So I shot the gun onto the ground, almost hitting the guy in the foot. And they came over and grabbed me by the hair and took me and put the gun up to my head. And then asked me, and the guy took another drink, and he said, "You ever drink Russian? Have you ever drink beer before?" And I'm like, "No, I was young, of course not. I don't drink beer." He said, "Then I'll have a shot." So he gave me some vodka. It was horrible. It tasted like gasoline. I never had a drink ever in my lifetime. Went ahead and I drank the vodka, and then unfortunately I couldn't stand it. And then all of a sudden I hear this clicking. And then he clicks again. He's got the gun up to my ear. I started running away. The guy grabbed me by the throat. He said, "Everything's funny to you, huh? You think you're going to try to shoot us?" And he's just clicking. And a couple of the soldiers didn't agree with it. They walked away. We're not going to intervene.
Just playing a joke
they
on
just
me,
not
killing
part
me
of it.
in my sleep. But in the morning, they gave me coffee and gave me
A few of the other soldiers did intervene and said, let me go.
what looked like a pre-made ration of some sort, like a military ration. You opened up the can, and it had little like a, something that looked like a fork. It was small, like metal. So it was kind of like a fork spoon, but it was made out of like a cheap metal, and you could eat off of it. And so had some bread in there, some like Stalin bread, stolen. I So I ate the bread, had a little piece of candy in there, ate the candy, and was very happy to, at this point, just walk off and see if they would do anything. I tried walking off, and the Russian general from the night before said to me, "Hey, Peter, I know that you won Russian roulette against all my guys. I want to repay you. I will help you, take you to safety." I didn't believe this at one bit at this point. I thought it was another hoax. So I told him I'm okay. Thank you very much. And I just pretended the roulette never happened, the Russian roulette. At this point, he said, "No, I insist. You come over, you stay with my wife and me. And remember, it was good luck, and very rarely did anybody ever survive. Apparently, only a few other people had ever survived it. So, I guess, what do I have to lose? I'm going to die anyway, of either the cold or starvation." So I go with the Russian general. I went to his house, met his wife, Pati, and I think his last name was Igorov, something like that. But he was a very famous general in Russia, and I didn't know this at the time. So I stayed there with his wife while he worked during the day. He came home, and they apparently had a child, but the child was killed in the war. So they were very happy. They almost looked at me as a child and their child. Very happy. I told them that my family was killed, and at this point, he felt very sorry for the Russian roulette, and he wanted to do something to help me because he did not know that my family was killed, that I was part of, that I've gone through so much pain. Being a general, he didn't really live a tough life after becoming a general. So I thought at this time I always wanted to be a general's driver. Kind of thought it was very cool because the driver always got to live the life of the general. Went ahead and I went with the Russian general sometimes out on his tasks, and I learned how to drive a Willys Jeep. And they would use some of the older German cars, like something called a Thing. I became very fond of this Thing that they called. It was basically a Volkswagen, a boxy Volkswagen Beetle. At the time, they didn't really call them Beetles. That was just considered a Volkswagen. So Anyway, one day, he asked me, why don't you become Russian and stay, become part of the family? And I told him, I said, I don't know where my brother is. I miss my brother, and I don't even know if he's alive. So the Russian general went ahead and he found my brother. Turns out my brother lived in a house with a few other guys his age, and they were able to avoid the war, and they were able to go out and catch food and take care of themselves, and I'm sure loot stores and so on. But anyway, so my brother was very happy to see me. My brother said that he had already been approached by United Nations, and the general said, well, great, come to Russia, and my brother said, no, I'm going to the United States. And I asked, what, is that the only place that we can go? I mean, can we go to Australia? I had always heard my family would talk about Austria and then Australia. So I always got them mixed up. I thought Australia was only very close to us. I did not know it was halfway across the world. So I ended up saying Austria, and everybody looked at me and laughed, and then they mean Australia. Well, I found out how far Australia was, and then that was a no-go for me. So my brother said the United States, and then you can see the Statue of Liberty. Well, I knew about the Statue of Liberty. It was given by France to the United States. And I had seen pictures of it, and I always imagined being in that harbor and being free. So I went ahead and I thanked the Russian general for letting me live there, and I said I'm going to go with my brother and maybe go to America. The Russian general, who I thought would be angry, he started tearing up and crying and wanted to make sure that we got there okay, and he was going to help us. He got a hold of the United Nations. So days later, after this call that he made at the United Nations, they came, they picked us up, and we tearfully said goodbye. Later I found out that he was probably second in charge of all of the Soviet Union. It was a very high man, but it was very easy to see that he was rich, of some sort, because he had a gate that surrounded his whole entire house by lots of acreage, and then his house was in the middle of nowhere, and it was very large. It was something that you would see from, like maybe a movie or something. It was very large. So I went ahead and I left with my brother, and the next day was the boat. So we got in the boat the next day, and they had some rations for us. Again, there were these different ones, but they were from the United States Navy, I guess, where you were able to open up these cans, and in these cans they had coffee, and they had like napkins and all sorts of stuff. And then they had predominantly something like ham spam or something like that. It was just unbelievable. It was the same food almost every day. I almost got so sick of it, but what do? You're happy to eat. But it worked. It was fine. It tasted jello-y, but I ate it anyway. And never was a coffee drinker. I would always ask around to see who had tea because my mother used to serve us tea, and then I would just drink the tea. So we went on this boat. It took weeks and weeks, and they asked us to work on the boat. So we worked on the boat. One day we got caught in a storm, and the storm was horrendous. The waves were, we looked over the bow of the ship, and it would go all the way down there, about 20, 30, 40 feet, and go all the way back up, and all the way back down. At this point, I almost got sick, and I just went down the stairs, and I tried to go to the bottom, very bottom of the ship as I possibly could, get away from the water and everything. It just was, I couldn't do it anymore. And I just slept. I woke up to some guys making lots of noise. And I couldn't understand what some of them were saying. They were from different places, Ireland and just different places. And they were older than me. And I woke up and walked over to the table, and they were making funny noises and stomping on the table and then playing drinking games. And they all had what looked like chips, little chips on the table. They were playing a card game of some sort. So an Irish guy, a big Irish guy, blonde hair, really gross, hadn't shaved. Most of us had not shaved or taken showers for weeks. But this guy, he really smelled bad. About 350, 400 pounds. Grabs me by the shoulder and says, hey, be my teammate, So I said, okay, I don't know why he wanted a child as his teammate, but okay, if that's what you want. Well, he kept on telling me to go over and to find out what the other cards were on the other side. So I would walk over and find out the other cards were that the other players had. And I went back and told him, and Mr. whispered in his ear. And he and I did this almost the entire night. Well, at the end of the night, this Irishman was drunk, and people accused him of cheating, but nobody was big enough to take him on. And the Irishman took all the money home, including a watch. The watch was called a Wittenauer watch, made of jewels and something else, but he had gotten it from someone else who apparently had money. So, anyway, this Irishman had his whole haul of money, and I would see him here and there, and before we got into America, into the harbor, he thanked me and gave me the watch.
Yes.
And I told him thank you. I appreciated it. He had become a friend of mine, and little by little I had gotten to like this guy, this rough, scruffy Irishman. Seemed to drink Scotch whiskey, and that's it, and drink a lot of it, many bottles of it. But at this point, he had made a lot of money on the ship, and nobody had dared challenge him. So all of a sudden, I hear him screaming to me, Peter, Peter, come upstairs. You have to hear. You have to see this. Here, listen. And I listened, and I heard the horn sound on the boat. It's kind of foggy. And then out of the fog came a arm, then a face of this gigantic statue, and then the entire statue. It was the Statue of Liberty, the one that I remembered previously that I had seen in a book. We were in America. We were immigrants that had came to America. I made it to America. My brother, all of a sudden, he came up, and he had been on the ship, again, with his friends, doing their own thing most of the time. Came up and grabbed me, picked me up in the air and said, hey, we made it to America. We did it. We did it. We did it. Mommy and Daddy, Mama and Papa would be so proud of us. And so we were in the harbor in New York, looking at the Statue of Liberty. I knew the statue existed, but the very thought of my mind, and a lot of things immigrants won't tell you, that they kind of wonder, how is a statue, how does it sit in the middle of the ocean like that? You know, is it floating? It's just so gigantic, but, you're so happy to be there that it's something that just crosses your mind and then leaves your mind. So, anyway, we get there, people have balloons, the door comes down from the boat, and none of us have taken showers, and it's just stinky, smelly. It's horrible. But being in America, though, made it all the better. We knew that we had freedom from back when I was shot twice, freedom of not being murdered, freedom of people not taking my food, freedom from being sick, freedom from being hurt, abused, freedom from people taking my home, freedom from people taking my life from me. And it was all done legally. We did it legally. We went through the United Nations and did it legally. We never took an easy way out. We did it legally. So, as time went on, my brother and I, we got new clothes, and the United Nations had food for us, and clothes and beds, and we stayed in a camp that, they were tents, but they were very warm tents. They were very nice, and everything was extremely nice. They took care of us. They were very generous to us. They tried to find a house for us. My brother, a gentleman came, and he was pretty rich. He said, that gentleman right there, I'll take him. He wanted someone to work for him, and his son. And he wanted to handpick the person, and he handpicked my uncle, Horst, or my brother Horst. So, he ended up taking Horst with him, and They left. I didn't see them again after that for a little while. Then I had a pair of family, they were arguing, and the guy said, well, I'll just take this one. And I ended up walking over to them, and they said, okay, let's go. Grabbed me, and we got in a car, and it was kind of they started the car up, and the muffler, you could hear it, and it, I was just happy to be in a car and to be heading to a home. Well, I went to this home, and the very first thing that night, I went to sleep, and a gentleman comes in, and he was drunk, and I was very scared. I got in a corner. I heard him beat up his wife. It's horrible. Horrible. I was scared, and I wanted to get out of there. I tried to leave. He grabbed me. He hit me. And then afterwards, he pulled my pants down. And then he started whipping my genitals. And until it burned so bad, I couldn't even go to the bathroom. It was horrible. The very next day, a lady came from social services, and I walked out there, and she asked me how things were going, and I looked up, and I saw the guy in the window looking at me, and I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to get hurt. So I didn't say anything. But as she's heading to her car, I ran towards the car. And the lady saw the fear on my face. She looked up and saw the gentleman. At this point, was already running out of his house. And she just took me and threw me in the car, and we left. That was my first experience, first house. Throughout the years, I stayed with 13 other foster parents. 6 of the foster parents were abusing me. 3 physically, 3 sexually. Always the man, usually. Honestly, I really wouldn't have minded if it was a woman, but at this point in my life, I was a man, basically. But unfortunately, other men I'm not into, so it wasn't something that I liked. And went to 14 different foster homes. Very difficult thing to talk about. I was abused, I was whipped, I was smacked, teeth broken, both my arms broken. Almost every one of my toes were broken, almost cut off at one point. They took my hands at one point, one guy, and he took me and he twisted my hands and called me a stupid Nazi. Even though the Nazis had killed my mother and led to the death of my family. I always got treated bad because everybody always thought that I was a Nazi. But I never did anything. I hated the Nazis. I hated where I came from. They killed my family. And everybody here in America treated me like I was the bad guy. I was in Michigan. I'd heard that my brother lived in Michigan, and he had stayed at a wealthy man. His name was Anderson. His last name was Anderson Music. And he was one of the wealthier men in Michigan. Michigan's temperature was very similar to Germany. The terrain is similar to Germany. So it was something that we were used to. We would have liked to have been into an area where it was a lot warmer, of course, like everybody, but we wouldn't have gotten used to it. This is the terrain that we were used to, so, and the climate was almost exactly the same. So, I met a friend of mine. His name was Edward Johnson. Well, Edward always would remind me of my dad's name, which was Eric, or Edward. Everybody would say Edward or Ed. And Eric was his real name, I guess, but Edward always reminded me of that. So Edward and I became very good friends. We stayed friends, matter of fact, all the way to my death in October the 13th, 2012. Always my friend, always my brother, Edward Johnson. I just wanted to tell Edward, thank you for your help. Thank you for being there. Now that I'm able to let you know, and maybe you'll hear this message, thank you for being there. And I used to say, just so you know, Edward, I used to say Das Vidania. Remember that? Anyway, now you know it's me. So we would go ahead and I spent so much time over there that they became my family. Mrs. Edward Johnson, her real name was Margaret. So Mrs. Margaret Johnson. And his father, Ed's father, was named also Edward. So I lived with them, and they treated me with their most respect of anybody. I never even reported where I lived after that. At this point, because I was close to 18 years old, and I just at this point never even cared to report where I was at, because I was happy where I was. I didn't need to be shifted around anymore. Abused, the system, they abused me in a very short time, only a couple of years. Edward and Margaret Johnson, they took care of me as their own throughout the rest of my life, which remained about 60 more years. I went to Michigan State University. Everybody was a university graduate. Mr. Edward Johnson, the father, senior, he was a doctor at Chrysler Corporation, and He actually was one of the inventors of the metal ball bearing. And he invented some other things, had some patents through there and some other companies as well too. But he always treated me with respect, and he valued education. Now, Edward wanted to go into the Marine Corps. Edward had already started through high school, already with the Marines and ROTC. So at this point, I wanted to go also, because if Edward was going, I'm going into the Army or something. As it turns out, the Army wanted me. So I took off, deployed to boot camp. I went with the Army. Edward went with the Marines, and he and I both got cross paths a few times, but we kind of had our own lives. Even though we were childhood friends, we got our own lives. I mean, we were teenage friends. I was in the Army. I got to finally drive my Jeep that I always wanted to drive. I drove for a 4-star general, and I also got to become the #1 marksman in the 3rd Armored Division, which is the division that I was in, 3rd Armored Division. Had a buddy, he had a Jeep next to mine. His name was Al. That's all I knew him by was Al. Didn't know his name or anything. Handsome guy, dark hair, blue eyes. Was a country boy from Tennessee. And me and Al, we got along pretty well. Al would joke around a lot. And gosh, man, this guy had his way with women. We would line up. We were sent to Germany. I would clean guns in my off time, and then I would drive the general wherever he needed me to drive. And Al, he drove the Jeep and then spent the other time with women. And I always got a kick out of how he was able to do that. But one day one guy said, "Hey, listen to the radio, Al's on the radio." And I'm like, what? Back then radio was not easy to find. It was like a shortwave radio. We just happened to just hear Al. And it was his voice. Al, yeah, he was talking about, ain't nothing but a hound dog crying all the time. And my first reaction was, I know that he is a hound dog, because he's a horny dog, and he wasn't crying all the time. I mean, he loved women, but he was a beautiful guy, very, very, very nice personality, and just very humble. Kind of like talk like this, y'all should come on over to, eat at my house in Tennessee, one of these days when we get back to the States. That he would say that all the time. one day I asked Al, I'm like, what is it anyway that you do? Why do you have all these women? He said, well, I'm a singer. I asked, he said he's a singer. He said, yeah, they call me the Elvis. The Elvis. Not L, the Elvis. And I said, is Elvis your real name? And he said, well, it's my real name now. And, I guess L was his short name. Elvis was his long name, but that's what he went by. Apparently he had another name that was never discussed. I never found out what it was, but so he had made some records back in the States, and one time he asked me, he goes, hey, you want a double date? I'm like, I looked over at the women that he was with, and I'm like, yeah, we'll double date. Yeah, sure. So we went to the American school in Germany, I think is what they called it, the American school in Germany. And his name was Priscilla. Mine was Maxine or Mary, or I don't remember exactly her name, but I think it was Maxine. She was the prom queen, and Priscilla was a really pretty girl. Apparently, very, a very stout family, was, well known. So we went, and Elvis was driving at first, and then he'd asked me to drive because he wanted to show off. He was going to show that how far he can jump out the window as we're driving. So he did that, and we're driving along, and we got the radio on, and at the time they had these large cars, Chevys were. I think it was a Chevy we were driving, and yeah, it was really nice. I don't know where L got it, but he later became Elvis and Elvis Presley, and later in the 70s and 80s, I would never talk to him again, but that was only because he became so famous. Nobody ever let him or let anybody talk to him. So plus he got involved a lot with drugs and some other things, and he lost that spirit that he had when he was a country boy. Started doing movies, and anyway, get back to that day. We had the date. He had the date with Priscilla. I had the date with my girl, and we sat in the back, and most of the ride, except for when Nell wanted to show off a little bit, and he would always yell, Yahoo! It was just kind of like, very free-spirited guy, always so happy. I mean, he was never upset about anything. But honestly, I can see why. I mean, his life was pretty good. So, anyway, he, at the end of the date, tells me that he's going to marry this Priscilla. I told him it was a joke. Like, are you kidding? You're over here and you just dated her. I mean, you're too young to get married. You just dated her. You just met her. And he's like, no, I'm going to marry this girl. That's exactly the words that came out of L's mouth. I'm going to marry this girl. So, time went on. We did our jobs, got separated. I had to go to I had a mission that I had to protect the president. So a lot of times we got called on missions like that where we had to go with the president and like as a bodyguard. And Al and I got split up, and I stayed in the 3rd Armored Division, and Al he took off and went back to the States to record a bunch of different albums, which now today are famous songs, but I didn't know that at the time. And then I finally got to go back to Michigan, talk to the Johnsons, Edward Johnson, my buddy, and he had come back from the Navy, the Marines, but he ended up getting promoted in the Marines to a pretty decent rank, and he was really involved with them. And so I knew that my best friend was not available all the time, so I thought, well, I'm going to go to college, I guess. I used to see this sign. We would travel up to Michigan State College at the time. They didn't call it a university in East Lansing, and meet girls there and so on. So I went to Michigan State College, and I had no money. I went there at the time. Ed was gone. Al had moved on to his career. Everybody had moved on to do their own things, and it was time for me to go ahead and make my life. So that's what I did. I slept on pool tables. It was always easy because they were open 24/7, and I would spend like a quarter about every few hours and then go to sleep. And I was such a regular that they never really bothered me. And I was friends with a lot of the football players. There's a few football players at the time. We this point now we're in the 1950s here. Michigan State was a powerhouse football team at this point. They were winning national champions left and right. And my roommate, who eventually became my roommate, I was able to get a dorm. There was a dorm that was open, and it came with a roommate. But if I wanted it, Michigan State said that they would give it to me. I had to take German classes just so that way my grades would stay up to par to where they would still pay for my college. So anyway, he went ahead and he was a star football player. I won't say his name, but I just know he was a star football player. He and I used to go to, I'll go ahead and say the name, but, if there's ever a problem, you can contact my son on any of the issues, but his name was Hank Bulla. Hank Bulla. Boy, me and Hank, we had some good times, I'll tell you that. We used to go out to the bars, and I would use Hank's driver's license, and Hank had won a national championship. So at this point, this national football organization, which would later become the NFL, was looking at him as, coming to work for them. But he, he was pretty famous, so, but he was a real shy guy. I used to use his ID, and we would go in and go into the bars, and that's how I found my women when we were young men in college. And he would go ahead, and he was so shy, I'd take his ID, go over there and say, hey, do you know who that guy is? That guy is Hank Bulla. Henry Bulla, that's who that is. So they went ahead and they would come over and be giggling and, hey, can we have your autograph? And anyway, say at least at that night we went home with those girls. And I liked it, to be honest. Half the time, Hank never cared if I stayed in the room, and I was staying at girls' houses anyway, so it never even really mattered where I stayed. Then I went to my college classes, and I always took German. I took every single kind of German class you could imagine, because that's how I could get my grades up. So if I get a B in something, if I know I'd get A in German, so I ended up always keep my grades around an A minus, B, or C, always above, a 2.0 or above standard. So, anyway, as time went on, I met this lady. We were at a dance, and she was the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. She looked like Jacqueline Kennedy. And, I was kind of a playboy, and she really didn't have a boyfriend. She told me she never even she said she only had one other boyfriend in high school. So I went ahead and asked her to dance. They had these dances, everybody stood around and, on both sides, and then you would go ahead and pick somebody and then dance. We danced, and that's how we met, and then I picked her up again, and anyway. And then in the 1959 era, after Hank had won about 3 national football, basically trophies, he went off to that National Football Association, which would become the NFL. And myself, I went ahead and I got married. At this point, I was about 25, going on 26, and she was 19. Her name was Geraldine Haber. Most beautiful woman I'd ever met. We had a daughter within 9 months. Her name was Erica. I always wanted a son named Eric. And so there's this song in Germany, Erica, they call it. And I just reminded me of that song, so instead of calling her Eric, I just went with that song and called her Erica. And my wife liked that name, and it worked out. Over the years, I was pretty abusive. I had never gotten rid of my demons from the war, from all of the hurt, the molestations, the rape, the breaking my arms, all the problems. And I really wanted a son. I really wanted a divorce. I didn't know what to do. I'd asked for sex from her, and I never got it. She just, she more or less cared about the children. So I went ahead and just found someone else. I was a manager over at a company in Chicago. We lived near Deering, and yeah, we I really never wanted to do anything behind her back, but I expected her to clean the house and to do everything, and she would fight me on that. And I really never learned how to have a good relationship with anybody. My mother was killed when she was 27. I went through all the torture and the rape and all the stories that I told you. And one day, it talks about maybe a divorce, but yeah, it was Darien, Illinois is where we lived. But she was sleeping, and we were over at her mom's house, and I wanted to have sex, and she didn't like the idea because we're at her mom's house. So I just did my thing and just let it happen here with my hand and stuck it in, and little by little, 9 months later, came out Eric. And boy, he was the most beautiful boy I had ever had. So delicate, so pretty, he had the perfect nose. Beautiful. I always hated my nose. My son. When I used to be a driver, I was driving, and one time I had actually gotten a Medal of Valor for this. I kicked the general out of the Jeep and ended up going down a hill with the Jeep, and the Jeep flipped over, broke my nose. I already had a big nose, a Jewish nose, and I had a big bump on there, but my son, he just had the most beautiful nose and beautiful ears. Got the best part of my wife and myself, and we called him Eric Edward Haber. A few months went by. Our relationship, I would come in, and I really didn't care anymore if we had sex or didn't, because I was having an affair with another lady. I had worked as a manager over at Montgomery Ward's. I was offered a job over at another company called Arling's. Arlen's, something like that. And I had my own office, so I took advantage of things when I could. The only thing is, I didn't expect that woman to fall in love with me, and she'd always write me letters and things. One day, I put my letters in a briefcase. Biggest mistake I could ever make. Came home, my daughter was 12. My wife just had a baby, and my daughter happened to find those letters. She read those letters, and it killed me. It killed me. Basically, they talked about how we had sex and what position, and how I couldn't see, how she couldn't wait to see me again, and a lot of dirty things that I'm not even going to mention here, but things that a 12-year-old should not be reading, especially my own daughter. Well, my daughter told my wife that, and one day I got really upset about it, because they bugged me about it again, and I already told them that was a subject I didn't want to discuss. It wouldn't happen again, but they kept bringing it up, and I grabbed my son, and grabbed my daughter, and I grabbed a gun, and I said, I'm going to take them from you. And I had a few guns. Obviously, I was a marksman. So I would have never hurt anybody, but I was upset. I was abusive. I beat my wife. She wouldn't vacuum the floor. I just hit her in the face. And as far as I knew, that was the right thing to do. She didn't do what I told her to. I slapped her. That's it. That's the kind of wife I have a wife that should be at home and doing the laundry and doing the dishes, and she should be ironing my shirts, getting things ready, because I'm taking home the check. But little did I ever know that it was much more greater than just my wife. It was about my kids. I wouldn't find this out till later on, 5 years down the road. She had already left me about 6 months when my son was 6 months old, and when I went to work, she left with the kids and took her stuff with her, with her brothers and sisters. They loaded up their vans and trailers and took everything and drove from Darien, Illinois. Actually, I think we lived in a different area at that point. We moved about 13 different times in 13 years. We lived about a different place almost every year. It was horrible. I should have never put them through that. But anyway, I mean, at this point, history is history. So my son and my daughter went with her, and on the weekends I would go try to visit them. At first, it was not a very comfortable thing. I would visit them at an apartment. My poor son just broke my heart every time I left. I would cry all the way home. I would drive from Chicago, where I worked at a furniture store, and I drive all the way back up to Michigan to see my kids. Break my heart every single time I had to see him. Just a little baby. He didn't deserve to have a life like that. He was just born in this world. My daughter, she didn't deserve that. She was just young still.
I'm so sorry.
nobody
So sorry.
really deserved anything.
So sorry.
And my past would haunt me night after night. I couldn't sleep. I had to take pills to help me sleep. I took sleeping pills. They were,
Valium.
at the time, they
Valium.
I don't know what they called them, but
Valium.
they made me sleep, and apparently they were like a narcotic of some sort. I didn't really care what they were called. I just knew that they made me feel a little bit better when I couldn't deal with my past and my present. So
Son, it's Valium.
I would go up and see my son. I had a nice Cadillac at this point, and it was a black, beautiful. I had two of them. I had a 19 early 70s. It was kind of almost like a yellow mustard color Cadillac with a beautiful interior, leather. You could smell the leather. The leather was beautiful. Kind of just like the one Elvis had. At this point now, I would see Elvis on TV. Elvis would later die in the late 1970s.
1970.
After he would have a stint in Las Vegas. He and I had never talked again, but we both knew, I'm sure deep down, that we had that history.
Yes.
And
Yes.
anyway, my son grew up. I decided to move to Michigan. My brother, who had a wealthy family, like I had said earlier, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Anderson. So difficult to remember, especially when you're dead. But Mr. Anderson was on his deathbed, and my brother asked him to sign the papers of the company over to him. My brother doesn't know that I know that, but he did that. We were one night, myself and I think my wife was there at the time, and this is before we got divorced, but we were talking about starting our own restaurant chain, and so I never did it, but of course he took that money and he invested it, bought his first restaurant, making hot dogs and pretzels, called it Swiss Pretzel Enterprises. Well, the only excuse that I could have to come and be able to get up and get a job in Michigan was my son, who was really the only reason why I wanted to be there, but he was also my only excuse. So I talked to my brother about it and told my brother my vision of building a lot of restaurants. And so that's what I got in charge to do with his company, and that's what we did. We built, over the years, 300 and over, well, we actually built about 100-something restaurants in Then we acquired from Coca-Cola another amount of restaurants because they had owed us some money, over $1 million. And one guy had been killed in a skiing accident. So his restaurants, which were all like corn dog on a stick, that kind of thing, all went up for auction, and we got them very cheap. So that put our restaurant count to 300 something. Anyway, worked, took my son whenever I could out. Always gave him a 20 when I saw him. Never really went over the history of anything. Matter of fact, using his voice right now, but I wanted to get this out to the world. The history of my life. I had promised to do this before I died, but nobody ever helped me with it. I was busy working, and I got a place in Michigan. Got an apartment over at some place called Ramble Woods in Lansing, Michigan. And in 2000 and actually 1970 or 1996, bought myself a different car. Had a black Cadillac, and I had a white Cadillac, and the white Cadillac
Stolen.
I had, because I knew my sister was there, my daughter was going to get married, and I wanted to utilize that Cadillac for their wedding, and I did do that, except we had a flat tire that day. But anyway, this is not quite the exciting part of the story, but they had gotten married. She got married to a guy named Mark, and as far as I know, they lived happily ever after. He was an excellent gentleman. He was always a gentleman to her and treated her well. And as for my son, he went to Michigan State. Both him and my daughter went to Michigan State. They were Michigan State alumni, and I'm extremely proud of them.
Proud father.
They did what I wanted for my children.
Proud of my children.
They both went. They found partners that went, or
My
at least my
children
daughter
both
did.
have degrees.
And I went. We
My
were all
nephew.
Michigan State graduates. All graduates.
No one
Me,
went to school.
an immigrant,
Just my
a
children.
nobody, a guy who was raped,
My grandson.
who was practically killed, lived this life that I
You survived.
gave you a story of, and my children made it.
Yes.
They made it through college, through all this
All this
trauma
trauma.
and a horrible past. I never told them that, but through my son, I'm making this recording, and I hope he listens to it. October, Horse died in 1990s. The company went bankrupt. He had he had cancer, but it affected his brain, and he was spending money unwisely up to $1 million a day in just gambling on stocks. Me, myself, I had a gambling problem. I couldn't hide those feelings from back in the day, and I wouldn't see a psychologist or psychiatrist or any help. I never thought about my kids. Just, I never thought that I could pass that to them.
Yes.
But October the 12th, October the 12th, I stopped breathing. Girl came over I was in this place called Meadow Lodge in Howell. Girl came to revive me, told me to wait for my children. I was age 78. I waited until October the 13th. My son had spent the whole night there. My daughter was there practically the whole night. Some of my family and friends were there. And I passed out at 4:20 on October the 13th, 2012. This will be the last thing that I ever say. I'm speaking through the voice of my son, and I doubt he'll remember this, but he'll listen to this recording and he'll know that I made this recording for him and for the understanding of where I came from in this world. Son, Schmelzer, I love you. I love you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jerry, for your help. I'm gonna goodbye now. I wish you all goodbye. XOXO. Thank you. I love you.
Oh. Honey, wake up. Wake up. Oh. Oh, man. I had a horrible dream. I don't know why. Well, it wasn't horrible, but it was just long about my dad's life.